All right, how you doing, Endernax?
I'm doing great. How are you doing, Sock Dunlop?
I'm
Believe it or not, before I even started streaming, I was at least, I was aware of your YouTube channel. I don't know.
really.
Crazy backlore. Yeah. Um,
It's
yeah,
just because you knew the memes, okay? Doesn't.
of course, right. I knew all the bread tube memes. Um, well, I had already had like an interest. It's so sad too because Lance hates me. I'm like 99% sure, but I like Lance back when he had like less than 10K subs on YouTube and wasn't streaming on Twitch. And I don't know how many times I've told Lance I like his content. I find it funny, but it doesn't matter. It's just I'm on the shit list because I'm not a socialist. So feels bad, man. All my heroes have turned out like I should have never streamed. I could have just like had this veneer that they would all love me if they just got to know the real me, but it didn't matter.
It didn't work out. Well, why do you?
No.
So, in addition to not being a socialist, is there anything else about you that you think that a progressive lefty might not like?
Well, I'm a conservative. I have conservative social values. I would say, I'm pro-life. I care about preserving the family, but that includes promoting families to people who've been traditionally left out of family units. And also, I think I have a different concept of what
Mm-hmm.
family is than the nuclear family, so it's a bit different. Religious values. I defend the religious quite a bit, but
Mm-hmm.
I think that I have some different takes.
So, on this one, so I guess I've allotted you 50 minutes, okay, Endernax. So, if you had to pick one issue to sell me on to bring me over to the conservative side, which issue would that be? Oh, actually, I should do the thing at the beginning. So, at the beginning, why don't you just tell people who you are, what you do, and where people can find you? The shell thing.
Gotcha. I'm Endernax. I'm just some loser who Twitch streams, and I have a YouTube. I'm socially conservative, economically probably center left, maybe a little bit more left on some issues. I advocate for positions that are pretty far left, but I'm pragmatic when it comes to policy, so I end up coming off as center left. Um, yeah, you can find me at YouTube. Channel name is Endernax, or you can find me on Twitch. Channel name is Endernax. So.
Okay. Well, so then on the issue, so the social conservative bit, because I guess that's what you thought we would disagree on. So, what
Mhm.
particular issue do you think would be the most interesting to have a discussion on that you'd most want to bring me over on?
Well, I see. Here's the thing. I don't know if your position is going to be that radical compared to mine when it comes to the family. I don't know that. So maybe that's the one I want to sell you on because it's probably the easiest sell.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I think promoting families and strong family ties is one way to bring about a future in the United States that is much more structurally sound than what we currently have.
Well, so then the question just becomes, how do you promote them? Are you just talking about like making people more interested in forming families, like a cultural thing? Just you want to advocate for that? Are you talking about state policy? If so, what?
Yeah, so I would advocate personally for a policy of like having a caretaker stipend. So if you're at home taking
Mm-hmm.
care of like a loved one or a kid, regardless of your gender or sex or the type of relationship that you're in, I think that the government should give you some type of stipend to stay home and take care of your kids. We know that the outcomes are better for especially children that have stay-at-home parents. That this is much better than preschool, and that universal pre-K is actually almost as good, but not quite as good as just having a stay-home parent. So.
Well, so I guess then the question is, I was trying to pull up this one. I want to say it's IFL studies, but there's a country called Hungary which has adopted a lot of these like family promoting policies. In fact, they
Mhm.
spend, depending on how you classify it, up to 1/6 of their GDP on family promoting policies.
Yeah.
And it doesn't seem like it's actually changed, for example, the fertility rate very much. It might have changed the marriage rate a little bit, but not by very much. I guess the question is, and similarly, they note that there has been a failure in general of like marriage promotion policies in the United States. Like it seems like the all of the marriage counseling plans the United States has done over the years, we've spent a decent amount of chunk of money on promoting marriage counseling and stuff like that. It hasn't actually increased the rate of marriage, or at least not substantially. So I guess the question is, in short, like let's say that we want more families, that's the goal. How do we know that these policies actually get us there?
Okay. So funnily enough, that you bring up Hungary, I'm 50% Hungarian.
Mm-hmm.
My ancestors are from there. My great grandparents came over during World War II, so they fled Hungary. I'm very aware of what's going on over there with not
Mm-hmm.
wait, it's Orban, not Erdogan. Orban and
Both
Viktor
pretty
Orban.
shook, yeah.
He's kind of a piece of shit, to be honest. I mean, his policies are not great. He's a lot of people on the left do not like this guy. I don't know that I would promote that the policies that I would promote are very different. So I actually To my knowledge, I thought Poland was the only one that had implemented any type of like, for like basically once you had a certain amount of children, you didn't
Hmm.
have to pay income tax anymore, which seems like a decent policy to me, but I wasn't aware that Hungary passed anything like that. As far as promoting natalism, I don't know that that's what I would promote. I'm simply, and the way that I'm thinking about the family is
Well,
more of like,
sorry, go ahead.
so capitalism went and separated us up into neat little family groups so that we can move around the country to produce the most economic output possible. That's not personally what I value. Instead, I more value the intergenerational family that exists in the same community. So having, like the the groups, the different family groups that all live in maybe three different houses, all in the same community over the course of 50 years. I would rather incentivize that type of structure than, hi, I just want you to pump out kids. I don't
Well,
necessarily care as much about that. I don't think that necessarily creates more stable communities.
I guess, I mean, so that's the, if the goal you're simply trying to promote is like intergenerational family structures, then it certainly is possible that these sort of stipends work to achieve that. I guess I haven't examined that one in particular. Usually the whole like family promotion stuff is stuff I get from more racist people, to be frankly honest, and so their goal is usually promote the birth rate. And so like Hungary and Poland, for what I think are essentially racist reasons, they want to pump up the native birth rate.
Well, they're essentially ethno states, right? I mean, basically every
I
European
mean,
country is. This is what I tell the ethno nats in America. I'm like, just go home. Like, why are you here? Like
I
if
mean,
you unironically, if you want an ethno state, it already exists. Go home. Shoo. Goodbye. It's not America. So
I mean, I don't know that I would call most European countries ethno states, but certainly Hungary and Poland seem to want to move in that direction. They aren't there
wait,
right
wait.
now.
What do you mean? They're like, wait. I have to look up the stats, but I'm like 80% sure all of them are like disproportionately their specific ethnic group inside of their region, right? Like
I
the
mean,
France is mostly French. The
sure,
UK
it's
is
just like
mostly
there's a difference between that like as a happenstance sort of thing versus that as like policy. And so usually the ethno state sort of thing is as policy. So the analogy would be more proper to like Israel or something, which actively promotes like the immigration of a certain type of ethnicity or a certain type of religion, right? They're promoting like an
sure.
ethno-religious sort of polity. But France is not like paying French people to move to France, as far as I'm aware.
No, but they don't have the greatest diaspora, and frankly, why would you want people from Quebec coming back home? They're pretty awful. So
Good point. Keep them there. Well, so I guess that's sort of a minor point. I guess like I don't necessarily have an opposition to promoting this sort of like family unit. The most opposition here that I have is this stuff can be very expensive, and it's not clear that it works. So like the child rearing stuff in Poland and Hungary is very expensive. We pay quite a bit of money for like child benefits in the United States, and it's not clear it actually increases, say, the rate of child birthing. The rate of
but
marriage has been on
but I
decline
don't
for like a
really
long
care
time.
about I don't really care about natalism. And
Well,
the number one reason people get divorced is due to financial concerns.
yeah,
Basically, marriages break apart due to like economic stresses forcing the two couples to get into fights, and then essentially being like, "Listen, we cannot stay together anymore. I can't deal with this." And we alleviate that in a lot of the ways that we would alleviate, people losing their jobs and the market as a whole. Like we already know this is occurring, right?
sure. I
Like
mean,
this.
so I don't oppose, like in particular, poverty reduction that happens to have the side effect of promoting the family. I don't think is something that I oppose. The question is, I guess, in particular, what like additional policy is there to this sort of family promotion? Like you suggested a child rearing credit, and this is something that I like.
Yeah.
I think that it's useful to pay people who have to do the emotional labor of raising children. Basically, and that's what you would want to see in something like a child tax credit, was something that like Matt Brunig promotes. This is like a pretty standard left-wing policy position. But what beyond that? Like the goal of doing that is not really that we want to like promote family structures. Is that we want to reduce child poverty. We want to ensure that children are raised out of poverty. So like what additional policy is there that's like specifically targeted at raising marriage rates, for example, that you would point to? And if you don't have it, that's fine.
Well, but then it's for me, it's as simple as attaching that stipend to being married to somebody, right? Like you're not going to receive the stipend unless you're committed to another person, and that in and of itself is a secular bond that the state recognizes for tax purposes and child rearing purposes. We understand that as a structure, marriage is much better than, let's say, a single parent household. Especially for children. So,
Well, so that one's a sort of mixed thing. It seems like single parent households are mostly worse due to the poverty. It seems like the two main drivers.
this isn't true. Like this is like This is unironically like the Bosch take that just happened with Suspect Sushi, where he tried to tell Suspect Sushi that it wasn't like that the fathers weren't around and that they weren't sticking around. It's because they weren't getting married, but actually they were still supporting the kid. Well, we know for a fact that there's sociological
Hmm.
damage that is done when the father is not in the household in and of itself. So yes, there might be somebody financially supporting the child, and that may help them be better than the person who's not being financially supported by the father, but they still have worse outcomes than if there was a father in the house.
So, in particular, I'm thinking of one study that I've cited before, and perhaps this is one you could offer some context on. Here, I'll post it in what I called stream pills. You should get a ping in just a moment. So,
Sure.
this one, which was N, how many? I forget. Oh man.
Here's what I've got on like just off the
Wake
top
up,
of my head.
liberal. I love you.
And
Let's see.
what's funny to
Only
me is that
51. This is
there's
not that large. It's kind of
if we promote this alternative family structure that looks at like the multi-generational family rather than the quote
Mhm.
unquote traditional nuclear family, which is just an amalgamation that's made up by essentially a desire to make people into economic inputs into a system as efficiently as possible. If we look at the more traditional multi-generational family, a lot of these problems go away because you end up having grandfathers or brothers or other people who've stuck around within this new type of family community for a longer period of time that can help with child rearing and help take on that type of role model like like one
So,
second.
sure. So
I
I
can't
don't.
post it here.
Yeah.
You're giving me Hungarian studies.
Here, one moment.
Okay.
So this will just let you post. I don't think it will load images, but it'll let you post like links and stuff.
Okay.
Um, so what I've read in short is that it seems like the study I posted above, for example, found that
Mhm.
it was only a sample of it looks like 104 people, so not very high quality. But in particular, it differentiated single parents who were single by choice, who were versus those who were single due to like a conflict of some kind. So whether they were like separated, divorced, or the other partner died. And in this study in particular, those single parents had insignificantly different results than others. Now, 104 is not a great sample size. Maybe you've got some more complicated studies on this one.
One second. Let me look at the one you posted.
This is 161. Yeah,
Wake
it's
up,
scoundrel
liberal.
sample
I love
sizes.
you.
Well, I mean, that's just what ends up happening. I mean, let's be honest here. It's hard to run these studies. It's very
Wake up,
expensive to
liberal.
run these
I
studies.
love you.
Getting grants for
Control.
these things are not easy. 51 solo mother families were compared to 52 two-parent families, all with 9-year-old child, blah, blah, blah. Donor insemination. So, okay, this is under the okay. I think that these are like very unique cases. If the study that you linked is specifically by people who can afford artificial insemination, they may have other networks around them, very stable home lives, things like parents who maybe are still existing in their lives, alternative
Well,
infrastructure
sure,
that
but this
exists.
is comparing, to be clear, solo families versus non-solo families that were
Right,
conceived by donor
but we're
insemination.
talking. No, I understand, right,
Hmm.
and so it's comparing the two differences. But I might contend that there may be something else. I obviously need to read the studies, or read what's going on. I honestly couldn't tell you off the top of my head whether or not the study was right or wrong. I think this is the inherent problem with linking studies with
Hmm.
like when you're talking to people, because it's not like you can reasonably go over the studies that I've linked and raised criticism towards them. I've never seen this study before. So I like, and I'm not going to sit here and lie and pretend like I have like the answer to whether or not this is a valid study.
So I guess so. This study it does look like when they controlled for income, there was still a significant impact of single versus dual households. Um, but I don't know. So I guess it's because I've seen like some studies like the one that I've posted. I guess I would need a larger sample study to know which one is the more correct, more true to most of the literature.
It's
Um,
just that donor insemination is so expensive and like such a niche thing to even consider. Like as a single parent to be
mhm.
doing that, you're gonna have to be in a position where you're like a very successful, maybe you're a very successful businesswoman and you're like,
Sure,
or
it might
maybe
be getting a
you're,
slightly higher sample of single parents than that, like of it might be getting a slightly better off sample of single parents than it is of like double
yeah.
parents. But if, as the study you suggested, since just posted that socioeconomic status is not actually a great correlate of how well the parenting works, that shouldn't actually factor into it much. If it turns
Sure.
out that socioeconomic status actually isn't a good predictor, then the fact that these are actually a socioeconomic disproportionate sample shouldn't actually matter in converse to critique this
No,
study.
that's fair. That's fair.
So yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'll put this in the to-do list. Wrong one. Hey, where'd it go?
It's okay. My lazy ass needs to collect sources on all this and have all of the counter sources ready. I have documents for pornography and
Well, so
wait,
interestingly, on the pornography one, there was a meta study that just came out the other day. Actually, let's stay on topic. Let's stay on topic.
No, listen. Link it to me. Okay.
Sure. Well, so I had been under the belief that it looked like nonviolent porn had a small but positive impact on violent aggression from a bunch of studies that I had read. And then this meta study came out and it suggested that there is not publication bias, but just that overall the effect size is basically near zero. And in particular, it was not significantly different than zero. Let me go find it here. Bias.
A lot of my stuff on porn is around protecting children. I think that when you have statistics like 55% of 14-year-olds have viewed pornography, it's pretty clear that we have some sort of systemic failure in regards to.
But the question is whether that causes a bad outcomes. Like conservatives have often pointed to sex education as leading to like similarly bad outcomes, right? You are literally exposing children to sexual content. You are literally providing it to them. You're like destroying their innocence.
It's a bit different. It's a bit different.
But I understand it's different. It's a different context and it's different content. But the question is only, to me, the only question is of outcomes. And so for sexual education, we know it decreases STD transmission rates. We know it decreases like pregnancy rates. There's even, I remember we read this in intro sociology. I think I can go find this. There was a study that found that kids who took rings of abstinence in like these balls of abstinence that they would do, like literally like these big concerts, had a higher rate of STD transmission and a higher rate of premarital not premarital, teenage birth. So I guess here's the meta study.
I'll look over it. I promise. I promise I will, because this is something I debate constantly. I agree that sex ed should be taught. So I'm not one of those people. But there is research to suggest that the younger you start watching pornography, the more likely you are to continue watching pornography and to watch pornography in excess amounts, which correlates to less academic performance, which correlates to more aggressive tendencies, more neurotic behavior.
Well, the question is whether it's causal. Like
I personally ban. Listen, at this point, I think that there's enough evidence to suggest that the internet in general and technology in general is not exactly safe for children to consume, especially in bursts of 8 hours every single day for their entire upbringing. Like, we already know that this changes the way that their brain functions. It makes young people more neurotic as they develop. Their brains function differently. They have less dopamine tolerance.
The problem, so all of these could be true, but so I'm just recalling another study that I was reading, which found similar effects. So it found that like people who did a lot of video games, this is another thing that people like to hate on. People who consumed a high rate of video games had higher rates of depression. But it was also true for people who consumed more TV. It was also true for people who consumed more
I'm
social
talking
media.
about actual like physical differences in the brain that neuroscientists have measured.
But the question is whether it's causal.
But there's a difference. There's a distinct difference, because if you're looking at people who are using technology, children who are using technology, and then you're comparing it to what you would expect to see in another sample size from like 10 years ago, right? We can measure this part of the brain is different in this way, and this is going to make them more neurotic. That's not just like, okay, this person is experiencing depression more often. That is an actual physical change in how your brain functions.
So, but depression too is like fundamentally a physical change. It's a change in like the chemicals and the
I
reuptake
agree.
rates. So
we're measuring. But we're measuring parts of the brain, right, that are physically changing. We're not. It's not. It's,
well, that's
it's
the question. Are they changing because of this? That's so.
What is the reason? What is the other reason then?
It could
because
be
if the sample size is that 8 hours, children who are using 8 hours of technology.
This is the classic problem with so-called correlational or observational studies.
Sure.
Is it that people self-select, like the people who would have had these different brains self-select into watching porn versus those who would have had the other brains don't watch porn? In other words, are the brain changes causing the porn, or is the porn causing the brain changes? We can't infer one from the other.
Yeah.
That's the
So
problem.
if like just out of curiosity, would you think that I was being a charitable person if, let's say, I was doing the same thing with hormone blockers with children? Like, oh well, we don't know if these correlative patterns that are happening in these studies have anything to do with better outcomes for these children. It could be something else entirely. And here's another suggestion for why these things exist. So maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we shouldn't like do anything about that. Maybe we shouldn't be giving hormone blockers to children,
Wake up,
as the UK
liberals.
is justified
Hello.
doing because they don't believe that the correlative studies are necessarily there. Like, and this is me bringing it up
Wake
because I
up,
genuinely
liberal.
believe that a lot of the
Hello.
times on the left, they'll
Mhm.
accept like a bunch of correlative studies that support things that support their ideology, right? And they never consider that there might be something wrong with that research. Instead, they'll grasp for straws and even point towards studies that have sample sizes as low as 7 people. Like, we don't even have good
Sure.
data at
So
this point.
Sure. I mean, so the reason that I personally believe in like the efficacy of stuff like say cross-sex hormones is because there's a meta study on this, and it does acknowledge that most of the studies you're talking about are these sort of correlational studies. They are low quality,
Mhm.
so it is hard to prove causation. However, the fact that virtually all of these studies have found a correlational evidence in this direction, and that it's of roughly the same magnitude, suggests that at least like it could be that it's all just happening for some other reason. But there's a fundamental difference in particular between say like pornography, which is something that people can self-select into, and that of like hormone usage, which is something that they have to go through this like institution for. So I'm not sure that you can attribute quite the same level of skepticism of causation here that you can for these pornography studies. It's like a much
Well, wait,
smaller.
I can link you. I can link you meta-analyses done. I can link you 4 different meta-analyses that were done with over like 100 different studies that all show the same trend. But then people will still hand wave them like, "Oh, this is crazy conspiracy nonsense." It's not crazy conspiracy nonsense. It's
Well,
just that you don't want to consider that maybe there might be something wrong with shoving endless amounts of dopamine into children's brain. It's not good for them. It's
I
not good
can.
for anybody. This was
I've
not how
considered
humans were
whether it's
designed to
wrong.
be.
The question. So there's two questions here. One is whether it's causal, and the second is even assuming it's causal, whether it leads to bad outcomes. And so the reason why, like the trans study in particular, that's just correlational, but it's
Mhm.
studying outcomes there. The stuff they're studying is like suicide attempts, and there's a reduction. So even if it's just
Sure.
correlational, there's this idea that hey, if we're being cautious, it's probably better to lean on the side which correlates at least
Mhm.
presumably with like suicide reduction. However, for pornography, when we look at like the outcomes, it's not clear that there's actually any significantly bad outcomes to come out of this. Yeah, maybe the brain structure is different, but if it doesn't affect anything that we care about,
It
why does it
does.
matter?
It does. It affects a lot. It affects your neuroticism, which, if you don't know what that is, it's basically the degree to which you're going to be able to control your emotion. This is a very important thing, especially for self control as you grow up. Basically, you're going to see children who have higher rates of trait neuroticism engage in more acts of violence. They're going to commit more impulsive actions. We also know that for a fact, like through multiple meta analysis, that people who are religious are going to end up having lower rates of mental illness. They're going to live happier lives. They're going to find more fulfillment in smaller things. They're not going to necessarily be as upset when they get lower paying jobs. But I could point to that and say like, okay, well then therefore we should promote religion to everybody. But then you would go, well, actually, there's some negative things that happen here. Okay, that's
No,
great.
because the
I
whole
can.
problem with the religion one is it seems like I'm betting it's a confounder there. It's that they have a community, and community has mostly died off in
Now,
American politics, and so you can promote this another way. There are other forms of community that you can promote that don't have the like sectional ties that religion does.
yeah, I would disagree. I would point you towards studies on leftist communities and the rates of mental illness within them.
I
Even
don't
in
think that
even in
like leftist
strong community
communities
bond.
having no, but
Sure, like
these are online people, right? Like leftist communities online are not the same thing as like in person communities. The benefit of the church is
oh,
that weekly
I'm
you go to
talking I'm
someone and
talking about
talk to another
universal.
person that you have like a friendship
I
with them.
No,
That's very
I'm
different.
talking about universal universalists. I'm talking about like groups like Quaker groups. I'm talking about secular groups like there's a tech meetup groups. Yeah, we can measure differences between religious groups and the outcomes that people are getting being involved in them, and also secular groups that people are just involved in, like in the community. Yeah, there's still good
Sure.
outcomes. I agree, but there's actually a functional difference. So I
Sure. So it could be like I haven't reviewed this literature. If you want to send it to me, be my guest. But my bet is that most of the correlation there is mostly due to the community effect. Like there was relatedly, we know that like homeschooled children tend to perform worse than non-homeschooled children. But homeschooled children who are in religious families tend to do better. And one of the reasons why is because they engage in more community activities, and the vast majority, like 99% of those community activities, are mediated by the church. And so I'm not entirely sure that what you're talking about here is actually anything specific to religion, or if it's something specific to community mediation.
No, because even the people who are involved in the community at the same rate, at the same measured rate as the people who are religious have worse outcomes. So like and this is not just one study; it's a meta-analysis. So I'll send it to you.
Sure, I would be interested to review it. Um, so I guess it's possible. So all I know about the pornography one is this violence. It could be that there's also a neuroticism outcome. Sure, these could be true. I guess I would need to review
Well,
these as
that's
well.
that's for technology, but like broadly technology in general. It also has a link toward pornography. There's only a couple of studies that show that, though.
But
The major link is technology use. But I would advocate for literally restricting children from using the internet and social media during certain hours of the day. So I I have no problem doing that, and you could do that through an age identification number.
okay. I mean, I guess I can't evaluate these without reading the studies. Like for this one, for the pornography meta-analysis, I reviewed it. It has decent methodology. It seems like it's true. It seems like it doesn't lead to increased violent behavior. Um, in fact, the only category of studies that they could find where pornography was associated with increased violent behavior was correlational studies of violent pornography. In the experimental one, they found no effect. No effect for like increased violent behavior. And so I guess the question then is like we see this for video games as well, another category of technology where the meta studies there either find no effect of video games on violence, or the effect of video games on violence is so incredibly small that it's negligible. You're talking about like
It's usually effects of violent video games acting on some other factor that's it's like a compounding variable, right? It's not the video games itself. It's like you were already like disproportionately going to be prone to this type of behavior because were engaging in like isolationary tendencies, and you weren't talking to people, and maybe you were using violent language, and
well,
you
that's
were
the
produced.
fundamental question. So the idea is if the true cause of this, like these bad outcomes, is something other than like the technology, then why restrict the technology? And so like you can point to these studies that seem to lead to like, hey, more neuroticism, but doesn't lead, for example, to like one of these outcomes that we would expect. If you expect more criminality, we would expect more violent behavior, but we don't. Maybe they're being very smart criminals and they're like very good at keeping their neuroticism in during like experimental treatments. But these just all seem very odd, I guess. I don't know. I guess the
One
if I had to
second.
draw one additional analysis, it's that for medicine, this is not like a particular defense of trans stuff. Medicine in general just has very low quality evidence, and so unfortunately, if we want to,
That's true.
basically if we want to continue doing medicine, we have to accept some low quality evidence. Like the options are basically either like you're basically going to exclude. I want to say it's around like 60% of medicine doesn't have really high quality evidence demonstrating that it's effective.
No, we literally people die because we don't have great medicinal research. So I mean, this
Yes.
happens.
Well, and so the options here are kind of like stop everything, or two, work with stuff that seems like it's leading to better outcomes, and then use additional research on those things to try and figure out whether it's actually occurring. And so, in particular, like on the trans one, the reason we do it is because it seems to have such an extreme outcome of like reduction of
Sure.
suicide, for example. Yeah.
So we so I mean, you also have to. It's also a matter of like weighing what is worth doing, what is not worth doing. I tend to fall on the side of like restricting pornography use, especially for children, seems to curtail their use later in life. There's all sorts of other negative side effects besides just the meta analysis that I've talked about regarding violence and pornography. There's also higher rates of divorce, lower rates of satisfaction within
But
relationships.
I'm betting this is all going to be correlational stuff. The type of people who might be watching porn, the type of people who aren't having it every night with their like partner, they might have a worse
No, that
relationship in
that's
general.
that's
Like,
not actually true. There are plenty of
how
people who
did
have
they
active
introduce
boyfriends.
causation into a study about porn? Did they like take someone and
How
like
did
make them watch porn and then 6 months later follow up to whether they had divorce? Is that
you're
really?
right. They're all correlative studies. I mean, there's
Ooh.
there's two studies that I cite that are multi-wave studies that were done over the course of I believe 20 or 30 years. The only time pornography use ever showed any positive correlation towards or either no correlation or a positive correlation towards staying in the relationship was when it was being used by men who were over the age of 60 years old. So basically, it's keeping like old farts who weren't getting sex from their spouse anymore happy. But other than that, it basically in some of these studies, divorce rates went up as much as almost doubled, basically, depending on the amount of porn that you used.
I mean, so it could be that this is genuinely what's occurring, but I guess the question, so this is like when people talk about like guns, for example, commonly
Sure.
when I say that, hey, I'd like to reduce the use of gun ownership because I think that it leads to suicide, and there's a bunch of studies actually demonstrating causal evidence for that. But people will say, hey, if you remove the gun, they'll just find another way to do it. The question is the relationship failing because people are watching a lot of porn, or would the person find something else to do? Is it that there's a fundamental problem with the relationship and the person is finding like some other activity to do rather than engaging with their partner because the relationship is genuinely not good?
Yeah, I mean that this is like a cultural issue. I feel like a lot of the times people either promise themselves into a relationship that they're not actually willing to commit to an extent that they're willing to grow and change as a person and like communicate with their partner. And we could get into a whole other side conversation about this. Personally, I think people are way too liberal with abandoning relationships. That this isn't really good for society in general, and it's probably like why all these conservatives are like, oh, cancel culture. Well, that's actually kind of an element. It's like you just drop people now. It seems human worth has been devalued. We don't really care about each other anymore. But
Well,
that's
so
besides the point. I
so one of the other suggestions you mentioned that you weren't tied to the nuclear family. So if the goal here is simply like maintaining relationships, why not move to a more fluid model of like relationships? So like for example, there's a whole book called "Why Women Had Better Sex Under Socialism," and one of its big themes is basically
I
that.
don't. Can I be honest with you? I don't really care about people having better sex. I
Well,
really couldn't give a shit.
no, the better sex is just like the headline. One of the
Nah.
particular findings that they found, for example, it was in narrative studies, so it's like low quality
Mhm.
evidence, but narrative studies of people in the Soviet Union found that over time, relationships increasingly shifted towards something where people would have sexual relations with their friends. So why is it not possible to imagine that we adopt an increasingly non-nuclear sort of extended family? For example, if you have like communal housing, like an apartment, rather than single family housing, like we do in suburbia, why is it not possible for there to be like non long-term tied, non-legally tied families? If that's like, why is in short, why not promote another form of family style than the one which you seem to be
I
relying on in these studies of porn,
I
for
have not
example?
I have not seen a single study that would ever suggest to me that the parents engaging in promiscuous sexual behavior with multiple partners have better outcomes for children. And I think that you would have a very hard time finding me any evidence that that's the case. I would suspect that there'd be many issues in regards to drama
Well,
that may occur in between these different relationship groups, and it may be very confusing to the children involved in these
well,
relationships.
so then the
And
question is,
I'm not talking about a fluid group. What I'm talking about is committing to your family, and that your family means more than just your spouse. It means your parents. It means your grandchildren. It means maybe your cousins. It means all of these different elements that people have abandoned in favor of moving all over the country so that they can work jobs.
so, but again, the question then is, what are the services that the families are providing to children that are not provided either by one, a form of non-traditional family, or two, either by like some sort of state intervention? You mentioned preschool, universal pre-K, for example. If the idea here
Sure.
is that single parents are simply unable to provide the level of attention that children require, why is it not feasible to imagine that we can employ people to provide that attention?
Well, it is feasible. That's why people promote universal pre-K. And there's, I mean, strong evidence to suggest that a
Wake
universal
up,
pre-K
neighbor.
program would reduce
Hello.
like criminal justice costs, it would reduce crime rates in general. It would boost like economic productivity. It would pay for itself and more. I mean, I agree. Universal pre-K is a good idea. I would just prefer a stay-at-home parent stipend
Well,
to a
sure.
universal pre-K.
So then the question is
But
why, right? Like just for the stay-at-home parent thing, you're basically
right.
requiring, say, half of
So
people in all
these two different
relationships.
wait, these things are different. These things are different, right? You're talking about
Mhm.
long-term relationship development with children, which is going to get into like clinical psychology with children, right?
Mhm.
Which is different than you going to a daycare for part of a day and then coming back home to the same people you're interacting with.
Well,
Your
so
parents being engaged in a fluid relationship where people come and go based on transactional sex doesn't leave much room for commitment. People are going to come and go out of your life, and that's going to mess with your head.
sure. So that could be true. I don't know. The basic question then is: let's say that you want these long-term relational commitments. Why could we not imagine a model where you have these state employees that stay fixed for long periods of time? Let's say that, for example, you got a pre-K. It's got like 3 teachers in it, and those teachers are fixed by contract to stay there for like 5, 10 years or something. So you're forming a relationship with this person, and they're probably going to stay there even longer. Why is it not possible that we can have these attachable bonds forming?
You're doing the actual like meme that conservatives read about, like the boomer conservatives are like, They want to replace the family with the state. Like, unironically, that's the
It's
meme.
not the state, it's the
outcome,
employer. If the idea is that
it
they
is
need these
different.
long-term
The
relationships, it's not it's not like
relationships.
Lenin.
Well, the relationships are inherently different. You're being paid to stay with them. You're not. It's not some sort of familial bond or some sort of
Sure, but if
commitment that you're
people,
making to this
if you,
child.
if as you
can
say,
abandon
people
them
aren't
at any point.
willing, if you
It's transactional.
but if you, as you say, people aren't willing to stay in these bonds anyway, if you are forcing people to stay in these marriage bonds somehow, right? Either incentivizing them financially, right? Which is basically, it's the same as paying someone to some degree. You're financially incentivizing someone to stay in a relationship. Why is that so different than forcing someone by employment contract to form these relationships with children?
It's funny to me that somebody who is further to the left than I am, perhaps, would suggest that this is a good idea when we know for a fact that trying to get people to do things for monetary incentive may not always pan out perfectly. That there are perverse incentives within these structures, especially within capitalism. That this person may abandon this job, they may quit, they may want to do something else, and you're going to restrict the freedoms, the autonomy of the person who is engaging in this voluntary work, perhaps you could say, to create a
But
relationship.
you're willing
with
to
this
do that
child
for
in
literally
order-
every relationship. If the problem you have is
well,
coercion, you
yes,
don't want to
difference
do
is
it just
you
for
have
like
a-
childcare
wait,
workers.
you
You want
have
to
a
do it for
direct-
literally
if you
every
abandon-
family.
Wait, if you
That's a much
abandon your
bigger
child,
scope.
yeah, you're a piece of shit. Yeah,
But then you
congratulations.
want, but then I'm saying you are. So if the problem is
But you're
coercion,
not a-
you are
wait, you're
coercing
not a
every
piece of shit.
family.
Wait, but you're not a piece of shit if you're a teacher and you decide to take a new job and abandon a child.
Sure.
That is not your responsibility.
And
as
so
a
that's
teacher.
why you'd want something like, say, 3 employees. One of them quits, so be it. The other 2 are still here for you.
Okay,
Like,
well, and then you're messing with the child's head because you have all of these different adults coming and going in their life that are supposed to be supposedly
coming and going on the scale of
transformational.
like coming and going on the scale of like 5 years. I mean, if you want to do some like evo psych appeals here, right? The rate of death of these people in like the ancient human communities or whatever had to be abysmal. The idea that people
You know
can't
that
come
there's,
and leave
like
them in your life.
biological connections between like infants and their parents, right? Like there's
is,
actual
but
evidence to
actually-
suggest that those relationships are deeper than other relationships.
It's so that's
there's a
true.
reason-
That's true.
Okay.
But humans are also one of the most what is called alloparental species on Earth. Non-parents have some of the strongest attachments to children of any species on Earth. Other species will literally kill the children of other like mates, for example. In this species, you are literally primed to hear the child of another mother and to respond to them and like care for them. One of the main theories, in fact, for why gay sex evolved, why gay people evolved, was in fact literally to provide alloparental people to provide care to children, to raise them even at higher quality. So the question is fundamentally, if humans, let's say that alloparental relationships are 90% as high quality as family relationships, but they're the kind of thing that we can do by policy with extreme effectiveness. You aren't requiring people to stay in a relationship by force. You aren't trying to do these sort of things, which don't seem to have panned out so far. But we know you can hire teachers. We know you can hire pre-K. Why not do the stuff that's proven, that's 90% as effective, let's say, just hypothetically?
This
Why
this
not
is
work?
only this is the only thing. The only time I would ever be okay with this system would be if there was things missing within this child's home. Like let's say they were in an orphanage. Or
Why not do it to
they
everyone?
were-
If additional long-term benefit,
Why
if
not
additional,
do it to everyone?
no,
Because
so-
it's not the state's role to go ahead and make and raise everybody's children for them.
Walk through your logic for a moment. So if the logic is that long-term relationships help children form more stable bonds, which in turn help them out through the rest of their life, why not provide more additional long-term stable bonds for children? Everyone should benefit from this. Even if you've got 2 long-term bonds with your parents, why not have 3? One with the state provider, right? One with like the state social worker who's with you for 18 years. Why not?
I'm surely not against a long-term relationship being had with a mentor or a teacher on the outside world. I just don't think it's the state's role to mandate that relationship. I would rather have programs that incentivize that behavior among existing family structures. Why not?
Sure, why not do both? So literally the question I'm asking, let's say that I totally adopt your family like plan. Somehow we're going to financially incentivize families to stick together and that raises the marriage rate, I don't know, 5% or something. Let's do that. And the teacher long-term plan. Why not do that? My mom was just telling me the other day that there was this neat cultural phenomenon in this one Japanese fishing village where children would be born and randomly paired into groups of 5, like what's it, quintuplets or whatever. So they weren't familially related, but they were considered as brothers to each other and they formed a social bond that for most of those people has lasted for the rest of their lives. If our goal is to promote these long-term relationships, why not create them artificially, either culturally or via the state?
Well, you absolutely can, and I'm essentially advocating for that system in the form of, I'm advocating for that system but first promoting the family unit as the caretaker. I'm saying that these are the people we have to look to first before we offer any extra services to these people.
Why
Something you
before?
brought up earlier. Wait, there's something that you brought up earlier in the conversation that I think is interesting, and that was like, well, we already give all of these resources. It doesn't really seem like it does much. Well,
Hmm.
okay. Well, then why are we implementing a policy across the entire nation
Because we know
mandating
pre-K
people form
works.
long-term relationships? Well,
Because we
we
know pre-K
absolutely
works. That's why.
well, we know well, absolutely we know pre-K works. I'm simply saying that we can have a stay-at-home parent incentivized prior to saying, okay, you can go to universal pre-K. I have no
So
problem with universal pre-K.
so one of the big
In
differences
fact, I think
here.
I well, wait, what
Go ahead.
I need to clarify something. It's not like I'm against this. I think that a better form of schooling even would be one where you have someone who is more highly qualified than what we have now, and you stay with that person over the course of 5 years. And instead of them just giving you content over and over and over, that they're feeding basically the same content to all the children, you have individual plans of care similar to what they do in special education. You bring in paraprofessionals, and they exist as like a staff adjunct. They lift these students up, and over the course of many years, you get to know these students, you know their weaknesses, you know their strengths, you know how like you're setting personal goals for them. This would be
Hmm.
great. This would probably be a much superior education system. And so I have no problem with setting up something like this. I simply don't agree with the idea that you're going to bring in these you specifically you brought up this scenario in the Soviet Union where people were being more
Hmm.
liberal with their sexual
But do you know
relationships.
the reason why the authors thought that was? It wasn't because the state was like forcing them to be liberal with their sexual relationship. It's because
No,
when relationships were decommodified and you weren't forced to stay with your husband for financial reasons, people choose to leave. In fact, one of the other studies I was
do you
going to
really
mention.
think that things were really hunky dory in the Soviet Union? That the material conditions and the attachments that you had to your community were really
It,
strong in the Soviet
I mean,
Union.
it's part of the same. So, like, this is actually something that conservatives will often tell me. The welfare state allows people to leave marriages. You aren't stuck. And I think liberals frame this as a positive and
This isn't
conservatives as a
actually true
negative.
though. Like this has been debunked. Even the most commonly cited study is the one on UBI where they freaked out and they were like, "Well, we can't do UBI anymore."
Hmm.
Nixon said, "Oh, we can't do UBI anymore because it leads to higher rates of divorce." That study was incorrect. It didn't actually lead to higher rates of divorce.
So I don't doubt that it doesn't lead to higher rates of divorce. For people who are genuinely interested in being with each other, I think they'll stick together. But one of the things that we saw is when states liberalized the ability to divorce. For example, back in the 70s, people don't often think about this, but most states adopted at-will divorce. It was now possible to file for a divorce for a reason which wasn't "my husband cheated on me." Back in the old days, people would fabricate, if they wanted to divorce, but both people wanted to divorce, they would literally fabricate a cheating story. Like the husband would lie to
Yeah.
the court and say, "I cheated," and so they would leave. Now anyone can divorce for any reason. My mom did it. Lots of people do it. The fundamental question is, if when we liberalize these relations, people genuinely seem to leave, why should we keep them in? If your assertion is we need to force them in to help the children out, why not do another solution which seems to have less coercion involved? This is something I was going
I'm
to
not
mention.
forcing them in. I want to cut down on like maybe we look at people getting addicted and using pornography too much, and that leading to expectations in their relationship that aren't realistic. Perhaps liberalization of sexual partners leads to
Actually, this is
dissatisfaction
actually a
amongst
really good
women.
argument for state owned production. We can produce aesthetically realistic,
Well,
relationshiply
there you go.
realistic pornography.
Listen, this is
Okay.
an argument. This is an argument I've heard from many anarchists and leftists, and at least it's consistent with your viewpoints. And I would prefer that system to the one that we have right now. So that'd be perfectly fine by me. By all means, if that's
So
as long as you would actually advocate for it, that would be ultimately better than what's going on now, where we have a system that's
the,
obfuscated by an industry that makes more money than every sports industry in our country, and obviously wants to keep making that money. They're going to do anything they can to make sure that you believe
well,
that they're not doing anything harmful.
to stick on the family note, the thing that I was trying to bring up is the scope of the coercion involved. When you're talking about like financially incentivizing people to stick in relationships they might not otherwise stick with, right? And I just want to say this is like clearly coercion. It's coercion the same way that employment is coercion. You are forced to do it for financial benefit. If you think that that's coercion, you should think this is coercion. It's almost one to one. So the analogy here
Yeah,
is,
I don't think it's coercion. I'm not a leftist in this sense. I don't
well,
really
no,
care about
I
it.
know. I'm just saying, like, if that's the argument, if the argument
Sure.
is that paying a teacher is coercion to stick with kids, if that's a coercion, then this too, I think, is coercion. So I just think that you have to be consistent on that one. If you don't, if you think neither is coercion, then neither is coercion. No big deal.
Yeah,
But the scope,
neither's coercion.
but
I just think that the idea that you're going to have these different parental figures, you could say, or mentors that are constantly coming in and out of the child's life is harmful to the child.
But so that's the whole idea of having long-term relationships, right? I like both culturally promoting this, and for example, so one of the things I was trying to bring up
But
is
we
the
were
scope of
talking,
this.
but you were talking specifically about like swinger groups in the USSR.
So,
So
well, it wasn't swinger groups. It was apparently virtually everyone was becoming more liberalized in their relationship, akin to some degree of what we're seeing in
all
those
right,
countries.
I'm gonna have to see this study. I'm very interested.
Sure.
I'm also very curious what part of the USSR this occurred in, or where this study happened,
I
and
believe
whether or not the
Moscow.
data was accurate.
Sure, it was a, as I said, it's not a extremely high quality study. It is a observational narrative based study of,
Hmm.
let's see, I forget how many. I want to say like 80 Russian middle class women in, I want to say Moscow and Leningrad, but I forget. Um, and so in this one, they found, quote, the Soviet silent generation, born between 1920 and 1945, primarily related to the quote unquote pro natalist script, meaning that sex was something you did in marriage to have babies.
Wait, this happened every. Wait, this
Yes.
literally. It's called the Roaring 20. Right, right. The like
No,
we.
no, no,
I
no, no, no.
understand.
This isn't the
This
Roaring
happened
20s. No, no,
literally.
no, no.
Wait, this literally happened everywhere. There was a massive amount of liberalization of sex. It happened in the United States too, and this was during the global financial crisis as well, the Great Depression,
Yes.
which every country suffered from, and also. I don't know, maybe a couple of civil wars and
Wake up,
I don't.
liberal.
Personally, I
Hello.
don't think this is the most stable environment to make an observation from.
Sure. So I agree that this happened basically everywhere. The argument is that fundamentally, when these relationships are liberalized, people do pursue these more liberalized relationships. The idea is that people are choosing differently. People don't choose to stay in these relationships by and large. The idea is fundamentally that like the huge rise of divorce we saw after at-will divorce, the huge rise of divorce after feminism became a cultural like norm, was basically by choice. It wasn't someone was forcing them to leave these relationships. I guess that's the fundamental thing I'm trying to drive. And in turn, trying to undo that is to some degree trying to force people into relationships they don't desire. And what I've been trying to bring up for a little bit is the scope of the like the interaction here. You're requiring all, let's say it's like 100 million relationships here, versus you're talking about something like say one teacher per like 15 students per like 10 students. The scope of the coercion here is just enormously larger when you're requiring so many more people to stick with so many more relationships than it is for some people who willingly get into a field of employment, who presumably enjoy that field of employment, and asking them to have like fixed term contracts where they do stuff. The scope of coercion here is just so incredibly smaller than the type that you're talking about. And I guess all I was trying to suggest here is that some of the services you seem to suggest that multi-generational families, that like larger families can provide, the question is in short, why not have even bigger families? I, I
I
guess
mean,
that's the
if you want to
fundamental question.
personally engage in that, that's perfectly fine. I just don't think there's much benefit to incentivizing those structures. Like if that's what you want to do as an individual, then by all means do so. I'm not personally in favor of polyamory and polygamy because I believe that personally you're going to see a lot more polygamists than you might suspect, and a lot of religious polygamists at that who
Mm-hmm.
might take up a lot of women who were Mormon. We'll just be completely honest here. There might be a lot of people in Utah who are
Mm-hmm.
polygamists more so than the average population. I don't know that this is good for society.
Sure. I mean, so the basic thing that I'm trying to suggest is that it's not about like sex per se. It's about relationships. So the question here is fundamentally, if if it is true that larger families seem to provide some of these benefits, if that having long-term relationships is important to a child's development, important even to maybe an adult's development, why not provide more of them? You mentioned you weren't married to the idea of the nuclear family. So when I suggested, for example, it's nuclear family. Let's imagine tomorrow every family is now nuclear family. Then let's add the third one in, which is like the state like social worker who's with there every week. There's actually a whole interesting study. I had a debate with an ANCAP who kept larping about wanting to throw pedos into wood chippers because he thought that was his solution to how you get rid of pedophilia and child sexual abuse in the ANCAP society, which turns out doesn't work. It's never worked. There's a reason that Epstein was able to get away with it for 25 years. Social
Yeah.
networks and personal protection prevent people from getting away with this stuff. So it turns out what
No,
actually
but
works
no, no,
is
no. But
social
that you don't
workers
need a
as
state.
welfare.
You don't need a state.
You
Okay, well,
absolutely do. They do work.
no, no,
They
no.
they reduce child
That's not.
sexual abuse.
I was joking. I was making a joke about the end cap, or I was going to. But anyways,
Okay, sorry.
um, listen, I have no problem with social workers and setting up these different welfare systems. I simply think that there's a hierarchy where you incentivize certain types of relationships or behaviors before you bring in or you introduce these other types of things. I think that trying to implement a system wherein you have a social worker involved in every single family in America is going to be virtually impossible. It's not pragmatic. It's not something that's going to be easy like popular. People are going to be very pissed off about it. They're not going to enjoy that the state is so involved in their life. There, for a lot of pragmatic reasons, this policy could never be implemented. But let's take
The,
a step back, okay?
but I mean, if
There
the
is
argument is that culture is like not amenable to this, then I think I could raise the same argument in converse. It seems like culturally, most people don't want the world that you desire. So if the argument
I
that you're going to raise
but
is I want
I'm
to change
simply
culture, then
providing
I would say I
I
want to change culture too.
I'm simply providing certain benefits to people who decide to engage in certain behaviors. I mean, if you want to do the same and promote a policy wherein the state gives social workers to every single parent, I wish you luck. I don't. I suspect that your attempt to change culture through policy is not going to work so well, whereas mine will have tangible benefits.
So in particular, the studies that I was thinking about they were mentioned in this document from the NCSL, and so the NCSL describes them as basically there's something called the National what's the NFP? I know it's National something Nurse Families Program. Found that just providing, like, it would be like every month a nurse comes to your house. Just doing that enormously reduced after someone gave birth in particular, and just doing that enormously reduced the rates of crime of youth currently. It enormously reduced abortion later in life because it reduced like
Yeah,
secondary.
I'd have to
Yeah,
see the
like
study.
sure. I guess I linked it. I know there's a lot of studies being traded, but I guess the
Yeah.
idea here is that social workers intervening can have enormous and like varied positive effects.
Well, this is why you have social workers. Yeah, I agree.
But in particular,
I'm
it's social
simply
workers coming
saying-
every month. It's a long-term relationship, even if it's a distance one.
I mean, that's perfectly fine. I think that this would be a different relationship than the ones you were describing.
Yeah. So the question is, if this works, if having a third party in the house makes it a lot less likely that a child is going to be abused by a parent.
It's also what their role is, obviously.
Well,
I
yeah.
think
So
it's also like where these people are being applied and where they're not being applied. Like, do you not see how, like, having a broad sweeping program wherein you introduce adults into children's lives as a replacement for long-term parental figures, instead of, I
it's
don't
not
know,
as a replacement.
incentivizing two
I
people who
think
create a baby together, stay together, or simply exist together in the same household to take care of that child?
so. Like one of the really things I think is very interesting is often people seem to think that socialists, particularly progressive socialists, are big collectivists. We want like everyone for the group, good of the group. But in particular, a whole lot of progressive thought nowadays is about empowering the individual. The whole idea here is that when you don't require people to stick in these relationships, you provide them what is called horizontal freedom. You can choose how you want to live your life with more freedom because you are provided a sort of welfare that doesn't force you into a certain style of living. Whereas it seems like conversely, you want to, by force, return people to certain forms of collective living.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I
No,
guess
no, absolutely. I mean, I'm not big on the whole unlimited freedom thing. I think that this actually leads to bad outcomes in certain cases. So I do believe in freedom. I do believe in, people having the right to do what they wish with their life for the most part. But yeah, there's obviously places you and I disagree insofar as where a person deserves liberty or not. There's also plenty of research to suggest that unlimited choices for humans may not lead to best outcomes.
sure, but it's not about unlimited choices. These are like
Well,
relatively common choices that people
ultimately
make,
it is,
right?
right? Like,
Well,
that's the objective, is the ultimate goal of leftists, especially libertarian leftist thought, is ultimate human freedom. It's
I
having
mean,
the
to
choice
some
to
degree,
do
yes,
whatever
but
you
I
want with your
also,
time.
so I have often mentioned myself that restricting people can improve their freedom in the long run. So I'm not averse to like some restrictions, but generally the restrictions I support are those that seem to be backed by a whole lot of evidence. We know that, for example, restricting people's dietary intake. I worked with, for example, the FDA's sodium reduction team. We know that reducing sodium, we know that reducing sugar intake helps people in the long run by reducing, basically, for salt, it's Alzheimer's and heart attack, and for like sugar, it's obesity, fundamentally. These in turn improve people's freedom down the line. So I'm willing to do these because they are evidence-based like interventions that we can point to. But I'm just not sure what I would point to here. Like everything you talked about is correlational studies. Where's the policy study? Where's the policy study?
But it's also very hard to find things like, well, okay, these people found more meaning in their lives, and then I could show you a study that this is the case. You're just gonna be like, well, this was literally just people saying that they found more meaning in their lives, or that they expressed more happiness because of their outcomes, or because they had, better the only things that I can really point you to materially, are like where things are directly measured through the scientific method, are like material conditions, like better outcomes in the form of your household income, or better outcomes in the form of mental health being an issue down the line in regards to you visiting a doctor for depression or anxiety, etc. These are the only things I can point you to. And the honest truth is that there's a difference here, in that I think that there's more than just the scientific method and the studies that I can show you. I'm very interested in what the data shows, especially where it supports my claims. Obviously, I like it when the data supports what I believe in, but there's a disconnect, because I do have some faith in something more. There is more purpose to life than just happiness. Happiness as a concept, as a construct, doesn't really seem to do it for most people. In fact, it seems to lead to people don't really have a grasp on what quote unquote happiness. I'm more concerned with meaning, with purpose, with people becoming fulfilled in their life, I suppose. So that's where we would disconnect.
So I guess I do have scheduled another
Which is
person
more
to talk
abstract.
to.
That's fine. I get it.
No. So I guess two things. maybe a closing thought, and then I'll ask you to shill yourself again. I know this was short, and I'm sorry for compressing it.
Oh, you're fine.
So my closing thought is I agree with the idea of human fulfillment and the idea of human flourishing in a broad sense. I don't agree with the religious parts of it, I think, but I do agree there is much more to life than just like temporary happiness. There's a whole lot of evidence that people can be irrational in the pursuit of happiness, and I do agree that unlimited freedom doesn't always achieve that. The question is fundamentally when evidence supports intervention. And so the reason, and I just can't remember the name of the article here. There's a whole blog, in fact, by one person who actually at my university, University of Maryland, who specifically studies more or less the policies you're talking about, policies that try to promote marriage, for example. And those policies just don't fucking work. The only policies that showed any positive effect on marriage were those that gave people money. And so the only thing that actually seemed to raise rates of marriage was just welfare. But the problem is it didn't raise it's not like, how do I put this? This is something that I think any leftist would agree. Reducing poverty and the side effect of of improving families and marriages. This is great, but there comes a point at which you're spending like $1,000 for a 0.1% increase in marriage, and it's just not worth it. You could be spending it directly on that preschool that you're talking about. And so that's why I think the evidence-based studies are so important here. That's, I guess, fundamentally where I think I'm disagreeing. I think that you have a whole lot of correlational stuff. And I know that a lot of stuff I point to is correlational as well. But like for the policy stuff, I try to get causal or near causal evidence. And I don't think you have that for the family evidence stuff. Yeah, I guess that's my conclusion. And I'll ask you a closing thought, and then I'll make you shill.
Sure. Yeah, I think that there's just a fundamental disagreement here. I don't think that I would ever advocate for a policy wherein we're shilling out billions of dollars and only saw like a 0.1% return. I think I'd like to think that I'm a bit more pragmatic than that. I wouldn't just shovel, I would not shove money into a fire. I do have some questions about some of the things you brought up. Notably, I think I would like to see the overview of the women in the USSR. I want to specifically review the literature on the social worker, the nurse, and what the effects were on the family. But I appreciate you having a discussion with me. I mean,
Sure.
I'm gonna put together a research document as my plan, okay? And then we're gonna come back and we're gonna be duking it out. But first, I'd like what I would like, if you're willing, is for both of us to collect research documents and exchange them before we even have a discussion.
Oh, sure. I mean, all of this is on. I don't know if you know about it. It's I put it all online just because people say this a lot that they want it. The stinky right winger fact sheet right here.
The stinky right winger fact sheet, incredible.
Oh no, I misspelled it again. One moment. Here you go.
What a name.
Look, I focus on what matters, okay? They're right wingers and they're stinky.
I don't know. I feel like leftists take less showers, to be honest. They're more concerned with the environment, so they're conserving water. I don't know. I feel like I can make a better argument.
So why don't we get your shill in?
Sure.
Tell us who you are, where people can find you, and what do you do?
I'm Endernax. I'm a socially conservative guy. I'm more economically left, interested in using the welfare state to implement some of my policy, as well as just make human existence better and people's lives better in general. I'm on Twitch at twitch.tv/Endernax and on YouTube at Endernax. You can follow me on Twitter. Thank you for having me on, man.
Sure, anytime. And have a lovely evening, Mr. Endernax.
Bye.
I'm going to kick him out so that I can go back to my normal camera setup and you guys can see my beautiful, beautiful face.